Nehemiah. Nehemiah. Yes. Took me by surprise.
Yes. It's a bit like somewhere in Cornwall that's called Delabole, which could be Delabole, or whichever way you want to play it.
We were corrected by locals.
We were. It is Delabole.
It is terrible.
I didn't really see it. It's chilly on the door.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Good to see you on Mothering Sunday. Well, we've reached session 27, so we're well over 37. So we're well over halfway.
27. Yeah.
And the story of Nehemiah, or as I was just saying recently, Nehemiah, whichever you prefer.
Let's do Nehemiah.
We start with a slight reprieve of last time, which was all about Ezra. Because the two stories are intertwined, although they were probably 100 years apart. We have three different kings called Artaxerxes in the Persian Empire. The first, the second, and the third. And they span 150 years. It's a long time. And during that time, of course, it was Persian rule over Jerusalem, and nothing political happened in Jerusalem. Nothing that was worthy of record, but we think it was in the time of the first Artaxerxes that another group of Jews had come from Babylon. And they came with Ezra, who brought a book of law with him. It had been formalized in Babylon, in those scholarly schools they had, but it was written in Hebrew, so in Jerusalem it had to be translated into Aramaic, and when Ezra read it to all the citizens there, and they took a week to get through it. If you remember that from last time. But Ezra had also ordered all the pure Jews who'd been in exile to divorce any impure wives they had married and to send them away together with all the children to preserve the purity of Jerusalem. Well, this decree had not endeared him to the aristocratic priests or to the new landed gentry, and as soon as Ezra could be forgotten, life in Jerusalem returned to normal, with even more marriages, linking blood with the new landed gentry who had no links with ancestors who'd lived in the exile. And time was moving on, but there was still a lingering consciousness that some pure Jews were far superior to others, dating right back to the rebuilding of the temple when they'd rejected any help from anyone who'd not come back from exile. Well, if Ezra's mission failed and was forgotten, we have to ask, why did Nehemiah succeed? And why was he proudly remembered years later? One reason, of course, was the passage of time. That heals a lot of things. And Persia had established the largest empire as yet experienced in the history of the world. But such vast empires need more than a strong king and a good communication system to cohere it into a whole. It needs a new religion and a new philosophy. And if you remember, the Persian prophet Zoroaster had provided the new religion with its two gods of light and darkness, and that was spreading its influence. But the best philosophy was coming from Greece, in the Greek city-states where Socrates and Plato were contemporaries. Each city-state within the Greek collection was a tiny microcosm of the large empire, but with ambitions and therefore no friend to Persia, which of course they envied. Trouble in store. But news of new ideas, however, always travelled along the world's trade routes. Times were now changing, even for the merchant traders. Old-style bartering was giving way to financial bargaining with the help of money. A gold Doric. You can guess who that was named after. Darius, who invented the coinage. And there are two, I think, silver coins, although they look more like pewter to me. But again, contemporary of the time that we're talking about. So coinage was coming into Persia, and the gold one was the Doric. King Darius, remember, had not only improved the system of roads, but had also introduced that common currency throughout his vast domains. And now, of course, the traders with coins in their pocket could travel from area to area to area and pay their way. So it was much, much easier for them. They could go wherever they wanted without being dependent on rich people's hospitality. And thus, they could become independent philosophers themselves and spread the new ideas. In time, the effect would be the waning of aristocratic power and the emergence of a new, self-confident middle class of people. The whole world seemed to be changing, but not at first for the Jews. The majority of Jews still lived and prospered in Babylon and continued their scholarly activities there, as it remained their cultural and scholarly centre for centuries. So we're not going to lose touch with them. They paid their temple tax regularly and occasionally went home to Jerusalem, the holy city. They went as pilgrims. But apart from the temple, what had been a capital city, Jerusalem, was now an unimportant place, and the satrap in Damascus was very happy for it to remain so. Well, this long Bible story focuses all the time on events in Jerusalem and its surrounding area. So we're aware of Babylon in the background, but it's not prominent in our story. Monotheism reigned supreme now in Jerusalem, no question about it, and the morale was fine amongst the priests and the Levites. But a lot of effort had been made at this time by those top people to record their ancestral trees. DNA.com. And they did this to prove who were the most highly respected among them, rather like Debrett amongst our aristocrats. And this, of course, endorsed the social divisions among the residents of Jerusalem. For those lower down the social scale, whose ancestors had not come back from Babylon, for them life was different and poorer. Their income was not derived from gifts to the temple, but by farming in the countryside and by trade. But sadly, though, trade was not flourishing, not as it had done before the exile, because of the lack of security in Jerusalem. When traders arrived and unpacked their wares, they were vulnerable. It was much safer for them to avoid Jerusalem altogether, what had been once a valuable trading centre. But our next story is of Nehemiah, whose dates are uncertain because he was a servant of, was it the first, the second, or the third King Artaxerxes? His story is now entwined with that of Ezra in one book, but expert opinion usually says this was not originally so. And Nehemiah came much later than Ezra, either in the time of the second or even the third King Artaxerxes. Nehemiah was a devout Jew, no question. Possibly of the legal school in Babylon. That's where he grew up. Given his knowledge of the growing book of Deuteronomy, that sounds possible. But he was incredibly rich, ambitious, and maybe a social upstart in Babylon. He had ambition, and his ambition led him into favour and service with the king of Persia himself, no less. And he took service as the king's personal cupbearer. Very honourable and responsible job. Let's look at a lovely picture. The king of Persia on his throne, and a throne always had a backdrop for kings so that they couldn't be stabbed in the back unawares. But look at the character behind the king. While the king is holding court, his servants are behind, and the number one servant right behind him was his cupbearer. Anytime the king wanted to drink, the cupbearer had to drink first out of the cup, so that if there was poison in it, it would be the king that wouldn't get it. I was very pleased finding that picture. It's very clear as to the status of the Persian court. And Nehemiah was his cupbearer. But it wouldn't matter, you see, if the cupbearer drank poison as long as the king didn't. But Nehemiah's own story starts in the capital city of Susa, now in Iran, where all the many reports arrived for the king from all parts of the huge empire. But one day, Nehemiah met one of his brothers, called Hanani, who arrived in Susa with several other Jews from Jerusalem. And Nehemiah asked how things were in Jerusalem, only to be told that life was not so good for the people there who were not of the priestly elite, because the traders didn't come. The reason, they told Nehemiah, was the lack of security, as the walls and gates had never been rebuilt after the destruction in 586. King Darius had sent money and materials and ordered the temple to be rebuilt, but not the walls. And Nehemiah was greatly saddened, so much so that the king himself noticed the next time Nehemiah was on his cupbearing duty. And Nehemiah was suddenly intimidated and much afraid. His response began, "May the king live forever," and told him about the walls of Jerusalem. And the king was obviously in a benign mood, sitting next to the queen, and asked what Nehemiah wanted. Very humbly, Nehemiah dared to ask for leave of absence to go to Jerusalem to help improve matters. The king agreed, but set a date for Nehemiah's return. He could go for a limited time. Well, he set off with a contingent of Persian soldiers to support his authority, together with letters to the satrap and the officers of beyond the river, granting him an untravelled passage on the way, and also a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, directing him to supply all the timber that Nehemiah would need. Nehemiah was obviously a very favoured servant in the court of the king of Persia. And all went well until they reached the satrap Sanballat and his deputy Tobiah in Damascus. Damascus, old enemy territory, remember, for Jerusalem, or the Jews. Well, Sanballat and Tobiah were greatly displeased that anyone would come to seek the welfare of Jerusalem. But as they had already established contacts with some of those second-class Jews who owned good houses in Jerusalem, they'd be certain to hear from them what was going on. So Nehemiah arrived in Jerusalem to a hostile welcome. No one wanted any Persian soldiers in the city, thank you very much. They didn't want a governor either. And the word tyrant was used to describe him in those days by Herodotus. Have you heard of Herodotus? The first known historian of the world. He was Greek. And he used the word tyrannos, in Latin tyrannus, in English a tyrant, to use this sort of governor, authorized in charge of a satrap for the Persian king. And it meant a rich upstart man who gained sole control over others before imposing his own ideas on them. Now, what better description of a tyrant today? The satrap of Damascus was not happy, and neither were the aristocratic people in the temple at Jerusalem. So after arriving and sensing the mood of the people, Nehemiah did nothing for 3 days. He said nothing to anyone, and he quietly absorbed the atmosphere. Then, with only a few trusted men for company, he set out secretly one night, telling no one where he was going or what he was going to do. He took only one horse for himself and set out to inspect the ruined walls of the city. The going was so rough, however, that he soon had to abandon his horse and struggle on without help. And the next day he met the temple priests and the other Jewish officials and announced to them that the king of Persia, no less, had given him permission to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem and also to command the necessary building materials. And they were suddenly impressed. Wow, they were willingly ready and agreed to help. So each family, each aristocratic family, priestly family, was given the task of rebuilding the part of the wall that was nearest to their own house. And at first all went well. Repairs made quick progress, particularly where the damage was not too severe. And it was well underway by the time the news reached Sanballat the satrap. And he was furious. Quote for your amusement, "What are these feeble Jews doing? Will they finish it in a day? Will they revive the stones out of the heaps of rubbish? Will they, and burnt ones at that?" And Tobiah joined in the ridicule, saying, "Oh, any fox going up on it would break it down again." When they heard even later that the work was proceeding well and the gaps were beginning to be closed, they began to fear for the future. The possibility that there was going to be a rebellion there. And Sanballat and Tobiah began to plan how they might disrupt the work and prevent it from being completed. Then Nehemiah's workers began to be afraid. They were wearied by so much rubbish that had to be cleared and frightened at the thought of being killed in a surprise attack by Sanballat. And Nehemiah then invented what we would call shift work. He ordered that only half the workforce should do the building during the day, but all the labourers who came from the countryside and been recruited from there should all carry weapons, so that wherever they went, they were armed and ready. Then others were to be armed guards permanently stationed all around the walls, with gaps between them, keeping a lookout for trouble. And if they did spot trouble, there would be trumpeters blaring out, alerting everyone to get to the danger and be ready to deal with it. Nehemiah then ordered there should be another group of guards on duty all through the nights as well as in daytime. Building, guarding, resting was the 24-hour routine, and it was successful. The work was soon half done. Meanwhile, Nehemiah received a deputation from the second-class Jews in Jerusalem during a time of bad harvest. And they complained about their treatment by the priestly people who were gradually reducing them to poverty and forcing their children into slavery. And I'm sure you've heard this sort of story before. Nehemiah called a big assembly, and having been well educated in the law school in Babylon when he was young, he reprimanded all the priests and the gentry who'd been responsible for the plight of their fellow Jews by buying up their fields and letting them get into debt when prices for bread rose beyond their means. Hence, they had to sell their children into slavery. Well, those who heard him promised to put everything right again, as the law required. He even made the priests sign up and take a solemn oath to do what they promised. He knew only too well that priests were often more concerned with correct rituals in the temple than keeping laws about how to treat other people. Always the big dichotomy in Judaism. Nehemiah himself decided that throughout his years as governor there, he would not charge any of them for his own food and expenses, but pay for them himself. Remember, he was very rich. He then declared he would never buy any land from them. His job was to devote all his energies to the rebuilding of the walls and the gates. Well, chapter 6 of Nehemiah's story recounts two efforts made by Sanballat and Tobiah to disrupt the work. They tried to capture him and do him harm. Once they asked him to meet them out in the countryside, but he refused, saying he couldn't leave the building work. 5 times they tried, even producing a letter that they were going to send to the king of Persia, saying that Nehemiah was going to proclaim himself king of Judah. Nehemiah was confident that the king of Persia trusted him, and he refused again. So the next effort was somebody called Shemaiah invited Nehemiah to meet him that night in the temple for safety, because he knew there was going to be an attempt to kill Nehemiah. And again Nehemiah refused, called his bluff. Yes, he had been sent by Sanballat and Tobiah. So danger was past, the rebuilding continued, and after only 52 more days, it was completed. A marvellous record for the workmanship of those days. There were no more gaps in the walls, and new heavy wooden doors filled the city's gateways. There was a huge celebration when that was completed. A long procession started out in the countryside, and everybody walked to the city, accompanied by trumpets, cymbals, lyres, and singers, we're told. Tremendous event. When they arrived at the gates, the priests blessed them before their procession divided, some turning left, some turning right. They walked around the walls until they met at the opposite side. Until they all met when they went to the temple, where a great sacrifice was offered in thanksgiving. And of course, great celebrations. When you get sacrifices of meat, it means the great feasting for everybody, as well as drinking. Well, the new walls made a big difference to Jerusalem, and the big gates ensured a new level of security for everybody. This in turn encouraged a lot more activity in the city. More houses were built. The population began to increase, and Nehemiah lavished hospitality in all directions, especially inviting merchants to come with goods for sale. More and more arrived, and prosperity was on the horizon again. Life was improving rapidly, especially for the poorer people. And then Nehemiah cancelled all debts and lowered the taxes. Yes, hints of Deuteronomy creeping in here. This was almost unbelievable. And for a while, Nehemiah was a popular man. But it didn't last long. At this point, there's a gap in Nehemiah's story that gives us an opportunity to wonder what's got lost, or what was deliberately written out. No idea. But remember that tyrants, both ancient and modern, take control of the press, one of their first activities. They take control of the press and edit all the records. So we can make our first visit to the later historical books of the Jewish people of the Maccabees in the Apocrypha. And there is a comment there in the first book of Maccabees. We find the comment, "The same things are reported in the memoirs of Nehemiah, and also that he founded a library and collected the books about the kings and prophets and the writings of David and letters of kings about votive offerings." So Nehemiah really was a cultured man collecting books. Well, of course, all founders of libraries who can afford to buy books buy the ones they choose. Remember that. And the future of those books is secure, because they'll all be copied again, because they're all on scrolls, and they will be copied again and again if they wear out. Now, I've got a picture here showing you of ancient libraries. On the left, just a collection of scrolls. You can see how fragile they were kept and how easily they could have got damaged and worn out. Time went past, and the picture in the middle shows you how they began to invent pigeonholes. Not like we have them, but with the sort of on the diagonal, so the scrolls could sit safely in their pigeonholes. And the book on the right is actually a picture of the old library in Alexandria in Egypt, which was massive, one of the biggest libraries the world has ever known, which got burnt down in the time of Cleopatra. That's a picture of the shelves of scrolls in that huge library there. And there would be row after row after row after row of those banks of shelves. So that was libraries beginning to be on the horizon. And it's interesting when you think the collectors chose the books they liked, that they agreed with. It gives a theme running through the whole story of their library. And what have we got? A theme running through all the books that were collected for the Old Testament. It just fits, doesn't it? You can see it all fitting into a pattern. And this is why the Old Testament itself tends to give a uniform point of view. And I'm sure my library at home is similar. I collect the authors I admire and respect and leave the others in the shop. So mine has a unity running through it too. And we can only guess what Nehemiah did not buy for his library or throughout. We have no means of knowing. Well, it's likely that many, if not all, the books that Nehemiah bought came from Babylon. And we have a huge shift. The authority of Babylon was coming to Jerusalem in the form of books. The scholars still stayed in Babylon, but the books were coming to Jerusalem, being kept by the high priests in the temple, and of course gradually, as time went by, became a bigger and bigger collection of authority for Jews. Well, they would most certainly have included some prophetic writings and laws of the Deuteronomic school, which promoted social justice amongst God's people. And Nehemiah had already acted in accordance with these laws with his dealings with the people in Jerusalem. So you can see the continuity of ideas. And Nehemiah then returned to the king of Persia, where he no doubt justified what he had achieved in Jerusalem. We don't know how long he was there this time, but he was allowed to return for a second term as governor. But on his return, my goodness, he was horrified by what had happened in his absence. With all the clout of a tyrant, he immediately ordered change. He was most horrified of all to find his old adversary Tobiah actually living inside the temple in a converted storehouse. He'd become the son-in-law of the priest Eliashib. In his anger, Nehemiah threw him out together with all his household furniture and gave orders that the rooms should be ritually purified and then restored to their proper use. Next, Nehemiah found that many of the Levites and temple singers were absent. Where were they? They were all farming for their existence out in the countryside because they'd not received their dues and income from the temple authorities. Nehemiah reprimanded the temple officials and restored order. He established a committee, 3 treasurers, 1 priest, 1 scribe, and 1 Levite. And the committee of 3 treasurers who were considered reliable and faithful were given the job of making sure that everybody got the correct temple wages in future. Nehemiah was a good administrator. But all this, of course, was tantamount to a declaration of war with the temple authorities. He was a layman, had no business to be there. And yet he was dictating to the priests how they should keep the temple purified and the law honoured. He not only decreed that this should happen, but he'd actually been involved in doing it himself, a layman. Nehemiah was determined to keep control over the priests because of their liberalism and their willingness to intermarry with families, well-to-do families, whose ancestors had not come from Babylon after the exile. And Nehemiah feared, like all the hardliners, that this was a slippery slope that would lead them, monotheists as they had proudly were now, back to the bad old days, when syncretism would or could return to pollute the temple and the city. Outsiders, whoever they were not to be part of the holy city. Oh, except when it suited them. Fortunately, religious wars did not worry Persia. Let them get on with it. But Nehemiah realized the necessity for keeping the priests in order. How could he, a layman, keep control of life in the temple? His answer? Use the Levites. Oh, what a good idea. They belonged in the temple, as well as being teachers of the faith, even though the haughty aristocratic priests looked down on them. Nehemiah summoned them, gave them the charge to be policemen in the temple. They were to be in charge, ensuring the purity of the temple at all times. And he endorsed this charge by providing a necessary income for them so that they were independent of the priests. And he introduced, wait for it, a new style of taxing. It was called tithing. You thought you'd heard all about it years ago, didn't you? No, you haven't. This was an equal 10% tax on total income for everybody, no matter what their income was, whether they were rich or poor. It was a surprise. It was brand new. Nehemiah had heard of this from the Greeks of Athens and Corinth. It appealed to him because of its fairness to everyone. And he made it law in Jerusalem. And then, of course, in the course of time, it was written into the Jewish Deuteronomic law. And then, of course, it was in Deuteronomy as if Moses had said it in the first place. Can you see? You get a new idea, but you validate it with the name of Moses. Well, this tithe tax was to be paid to the Levites, independently from their temple dues. Never before had the Levites been treated so very well. They were definitely Nehemiah's men from now on. And now Nehemiah, the layman, had full control over the temple. Well, next Nehemiah turned his attention to a new problem, and one of his own making. Oh, let's have a look at those Levites. Look at them. Very honoured people now, thanks to Nehemiah. Very busy, being policemen of the temple. But Nehemiah turned his attention next to the new problem of his own making. Because since the walls and the gates had brought security to Jerusalem, and merchants and traders had flocked in to do business every day, Sunday by Sunday, Nehemiah had grown up in Babylon, where the Jews had learnt the advantage of a Sabbath rest every seventh day. And this was now at the heart of all Jewish lay worship of God away from the temple, so well established in Babylon. Nehemiah decided to impose this into the weekly routine of life in Jerusalem. Consequently, he ordered the gates to be locked from sunset on Friday to sunset on Saturday. Locked gates. How about that? No traders could get in. Likewise, no people could get out. The Sabbath was a day of rest. Trading was impossible, and the Levite policemen made absolutely sure that no one disobeyed. And at last, Nehemiah was strong enough to do what Ezra had failed to maintain. The last verses in his book, in chapter 13, describe how he cleansed the people of Jerusalem by brutally throwing out all foreigners who'd married into Jewish families and defiled them. In particular, he recorded how he had personally chased away the high priest's grandson, who dared to marry the daughter of Sanballat. Gosh. I chased him away from me, he said, and no doubt was pleased to see the back of him. And Nehemiah's book ends with a prayer. Thus I cleanse them, O Lord, from everything foreign, and establish the duties of the priests and the Levites, each in his own work. And I provided for the wood offering at appointed times and for the firstfruits. Remember me, O my God. End of book. Well, Nehemiah was an outstanding administrator and used his own personal wealth to get his own way when he met opposition. He did more than anyone else we know of to enhance Jerusalem and the temple at the heart of Judaism for the future. You know, it just wouldn't have been the same without Nehemiah. And the input from the lay-led movements and scholarship from Babylon were well established. Jerusalem would now be the center stage for all Jews for all time in the future. No one, however, is perfect. Nehemiah wasn't perfect. The people of Jerusalem weren't perfect. Nor was the future. They were all human. And the biggest downside was the effect of the purity policy. It soon degenerated into outward show of purity, rather than inner devotion to principle. And this became more visible when the Jews began to refuse to eat at table with anybody who wasn't one of them. So big divisions beginning to divide the society. Well, I'm afraid we know nothing more about Nehemiah's life, and we have no more Jewish heroes with stories to tell for many years to come. But life went on in Jerusalem, with more and more culture and scholarship coming from Babylon. The Persian Empire continued, and more new ideas were travelling along the roads, coming in particularly from Greece. And we shall meet much more about Greece next time. Next time will be on the 2nd of April, fortnight's time, at 4:30. I hope to see you all then.
Good.
And such was the joy of Nehemiah.